Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Front Office U podcast. My name is Ryan Carney. Really excited to be hosting today's episode. We have a very special guest joining us on this edition of Front Office U Friday. It is Eric Weissman joining us as a scout for the Los Angeles Kings in the NHL. So super excited to get this conversation going, Eric. And thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely going to be a fun conversation, kind of diving into the world of hockey operations. But kind of let's start with kind of where you're at now today, Eric. Scouting for the Los Angeles Kings in the NHL. For those that may not be as familiar with some of the different responsibilities and tasks associated with being a scout, would love for you to be able to just kind of highlight that for our listeners here at the start in terms of what all kind of goes into all of the components of being a scout at the NHL level.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm with the LA Kings currently. I've been lucky enough to be with them. This was my ninth season with them. I was with another organization prior to that. But with LA, I am a pro scout. So it means I'm on the pro side. Typically, teams break their scouting departments into two. You have the pro and the amateur side, and it's just what it sounds like. The amateur side focuses on amateur players, which essentially means, getting ready for the draft and the body of work that comes with that. The pro side is, typically players that have already been drafted or are already playing somewhere among the professional ranks, whether that be the NHL, AHL, East Coast League, Europe, or a reserve list player that we like to call. So a drafted prospect who might have signed or may not have signed, but has not joined the pro ranks. So maybe they're drafted, but they're back in juniors, or they're playing NCAA, or they're back in Europe, any of those various places before joining the team in that capacity at the NHL level or the AHL level. So essentially, my role on the pro side is to cover the American Hockey League. And in addition to that is these reserve list prospects that I just sort of mentioned. So the American Hockey League, is kind of a set finite number of teams, the way the NHL is set up. And the reserve list is a large pool of players because it's really all these players that are not yet in the pro ranks. They could have signed, depending on where they're playing, which means their contract would have had to slide. So maybe they're back in juniors, maybe they're not signed yet, and they're still playing in college, as I had mentioned. But it's a large pool of players, and it's kind of more open-ended. So in that sense, it is kind of a gray area between the pro and the amateur side. Different orgs handle it differently. For us, myself, I'm on the pro side, and that's kind of the perspective we use going in for that sort of coverage. So yeah, that's my role.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear and appreciate you kind of sharing on the overview on kind of those two different sides when you talk about the pro and the amateur side of scouting. I know you've gained some experience on both sides as well in some of your past experiences too. So we'll definitely kind of dive into that as we get further in on the podcast as well. But I want to kind of take a few steps back, Eric, talk about your background and early experiences in terms of developing this passion for working in hockey. So when you were younger, why don't you share a little bit? What were some of those sports that you played when you were younger, and who were maybe some of those family members that really impacted you in terms of developing that passion for sports too?
Yeah, so I grew up in Buffalo. So it's winter most of the year. So that was really the emphasis, I think, on hockey and just outdoor winter sports. I've always been, I grew up skiing and snowboarding. I still snowboard, when I get a chance to this day. It's one of my main hobbies. But really, like most kids, I dabbled in all sports. I played Little League baseball, lacrosse in high school after the hockey season. And but really my main focus was always hockey. In the summertime we used to, spend all day playing roller hockey. We would, occupy the tennis courts and use it, horizontally and kind of take up both courts and just be out there all day in these marathon sessions. And those are some of my earliest memories. Athletically speaking, I was just average. To be fair, I don't, I compared to some other, players, I'm not really from an athletic family, so I was one of those hockey players that had to work for everything and maybe, had to figure out a way to, use hockey sense and compete and that sort of thing just to keep up. But definitely not a natural athlete. And I don't really come from a sports family. My parents, my dad, he's not a hockey guy and wasn't even really a sports guy, but I think, kind of the unique situation for me was he worked in 1996. The Buffalo Sabres moved from the old arena, the Memorial Auditorium, probably way before, well before you were born, but it was where they played from like 1970 and 1996. Everything was moving from like analog to digital. You had these digital signage, jumbotrons. It was all new at the time, and he's an AV technician. So he got this role. As the new arena was being built, and obviously I was just, super pumped because I loved hockey, and it kind of granted me this unique access. I sort of, in a lot of ways, grew up around that arena, just going to work with him. He wasn't, in hockey ops or team ops or anything like that. Most days he was, his office was basically looked more like a boiler room, to be honest with you. And then, it was a lot, pretty, labor intensive. So, I would help him, but really I kind of used that I was just a rink rat running around bothering people. So eventually they put me to work, and so I did all sorts of things, and it was kind of just a cool access that maybe other kids, weren't lucky enough to have. And from there, like that's where, a lot of my passion grew.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I feel like so often in sports we talk about like finding ways to get your foot in the door. That's certainly one of the more unique ways to do it,
Yeah.
but obviously still worked out in your favor in the long run. So awesome for you to be able to share about that background as well. And we'll definitely kind of dive into how you were able to get involved here with the Sabres in just a second. But I first want to kind of ask you about your decision to attend college. I know you stayed in upstate New York, going to SUNY Cortland. So why don't you share a little bit what made that the right fit for you in terms of where you wanted to go to school, and talk us through that decision process in terms of how you reached that conclusion to go to school at SUNY Cortland.
Yeah. From a young age, I had learned that sport management was actually in a major, and in some cases a program in and of itself, depending on the school. And I had kind of been dead set on from an early age, like I was probably, 11, 12, into my teens, where, I want to run a hockey team, as delusional as I may have been back then, or didn't maybe have a full grasp or understanding of what that entailed. I just knew that, I wanted to work in hockey. If I can't play hockey professionally, I want to be around it in some sort of capacity. So, I was dead set on first and foremost, that's the priority, find a school where I can study sport management. From there, it kind of lined up nicely because, financially speaking, being able to go to a state school, took some of the burden off of tuition and made it more feasible for myself and for my family. So that made sense. Cortland was about 2.5 hours away, so far enough where, I wasn't at home, and like most kids, I didn't want to stay at home, and I wanted to go, experience something new and be around different people, and but also, close enough where I could drive home when I needed to, that sort of thing. So it was a nice blend there. And on top of it, Cortland, one thing that was unique, it was about 5,000 undergrad in Division 3, but they offered not only sport management, but rather than it just being a major, they had an entire school and program dedicated to it, which I saw was a differentiator among some of the other schools, other programs I visited. And so, the decision kind of made sense. But with having said that, I don't think that's, a huge factor. I think a lot of the sport management programs out there are awesome, whether they have a dedicated school or program or however, the landscape of that is, it's what you do with it. And I'm not saying, because it had its own school, I was better off there, but it definitely attracted me to it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And good kind of forward thinking and saying like, hey, how can I set myself up for success after graduating? And that plays such a big part of it. And
Yeah.
awesome to hear you were able to do that. And that kind of leads us, into your working experience that you're able to gain with the Buffalo Sabres as well. And you kind of shared about how you're able to kind of initially get your foot in the door with your dad being an AV technician. But how were you able to kind of turn those initial opportunities of just kind of running around the rink into now I'm actually able to start doing some work and helping out on the hockey ops side? So I know you were able to kind of gradually work your way up within that organization, but when you kind of were first, in the early going, how did you kind of have some early conversations to set yourself up to start getting some experience in hockey ops?
Yeah. So, I think one thing Cortland was really good at was hammering home the fact that, supplementary to our coursework, you really need to be out in the field working. And it's never too early to kind of have that practical experience and the connections that might come with it. So I really focused on that. Uh, my grades, they were fine, but they weren't going to distinguish me from the next student. And hockey and sports in general can be a competitive career landscape. So I think, I set myself up, and through the help of my school being able to facilitate that, I was able to really take advantage of practical experience. So over those years, from freshman year till I graduated, I was doing everything I could. Just some, odd jobs off the top of my head. I would be a broadcast runner. So anytime ESPN was in Buffalo and it was, a nationally televised broadcast, or even NFL games, they would have some like kind of a local gopher type, just fetching, running errands, picking up the talent from the hotel, doing whatever you needed for the broadcast crew. So I did that a bunch. I was a help desk technician back at that same arena when they hosted the NCAA tournament. Obviously, there's huge media presence. So it was basically, again, I was just a liaison between the arena, the Buffalo itself, and all the incoming media. In addition to that stuff, while at Cortland, I worked at a place called Greek Peak, which is a local ski hill. I mean, that was more kind of hobby based, but also I guess a little adjacent to sports. In the summers, I worked for a company called Indigo, which is a production company, and I was a stagehand building stages. So not sports, but definitely event operations based. And then a lot of things in between all that. And then the other differentiator I just want to mention real quick is Cortland at the time had like a video lab. We used a couple programs, what's referred to as Exos today, but they also had sports code, which is I can get it. I use that a lot. It's a non-linear editing software, and this is early 2000s, mid. So it seems commonplace today, but at the time it wasn't. It was pretty brand new. There was another program called Dartfish, which is like more mechanically based and breaks down frame by frame a golf swing. A hockey shot, things like that, the mechanics. So all that was available, and you could, get credits for it and have it a part of your formal coursework, or you could just have access to it yourself and go from there. And I was able to kind of, I made sure to all these touch points in Buffalo to kind of keep the hockey ops people. Well, I'll go back. I had one person that I knew who was initially in media relations. His name was Scott Schranz, and he was our coordinator in the hockey ops department at the time. And I was telling him about how this video, and he was mentioning, about they're trying to use all available resources and maybe not only just use video for coaching, but apply it to the front office and the scouting staff. And so that was a little bit of my foot in the door that I had this familiarity with it. And I think the general manager at the time, Darcy Regier, that kind of got his attention a little bit. And that led to an internship, in between my junior and senior year. And then I went back for another internship and, a grad assistant. And that started the slow climb.
That's so awesome to hear about, and definitely, ahead of your time for sure. You talk about some of those video softwares that, like you said, any kind of college program is going to have something at that point. But even at the NHL level at that time, it definitely was, oh wow, this is a separator that you already have that familiarity there. So I think that's so awesome that you were able to kind of immediately provide some value to them, which I think is so important. And trying to yeah, get your foot in the door, get other people's attention. Being able to provide some immediate value, I think definitely helped you kind of stand out there. And I know that another aspect of this is you kind of were able to continue to develop within the Sabres was, as you mentioned, being a grad assistant with the Sabres as well. So as you were able to kind of, work your way up from these internships, what did you kind of take away, in those early years when, maybe you're not making as much money, you're still trying to kind of establish yourself and gain that experience. What were some of those kind of key things that you look back upon that, set you up for success in that role?
Yeah, I think one of the areas I give myself a lot of credit for at a young age when I didn't know what I didn't know, and I was kind of ignorant in a lot of ways. But one thing that always served me well was making myself useful. And it wasn't always glamorous, but I was good, and I like to think that I still am. I was good at kind of spotting blockers along processes And, maybe it's something you hear in passing that the general manager says, or one of the assistant GMs say, or one of your colleagues mentions. And you kind of just bank that and you think about, well, I can work on that. So in addition to my day-to-day tasks, I would take on kind of these separate projects, even, we call them case studies, even at some point. I mean, maybe that's probably the wrong term for it. But and then I would deliver, what I learned, what I figured out, a solution. And really, I think the point I'm making is I was able to present this information and get it to people of influence, decision makers, before they asked for it, before the problem itself arose. And I think that really served me well and, maybe changed their perception of this is a guy who, is a self-starter and he's forward thinking and he just makes my life easier and makes the day-to-day easier. And again, like I said, sometimes it could be menial tasks. It doesn't need to be this big picture thing. But I've always had my ear to the ground and kind of just banking that information and in my head maybe putting together a process. And it's a slow burn. A lot of times I notice, especially at a young age, when you do introduce something or you try to, get your work have visibility, at the time it might not feel like it does or wasn't given the attention that you might have hoped it would, but sometimes it will. Sometimes that comes later, and it could be a month later, it could be a year later. But when that problem arises and it gets, someone of influence their attention, there's already a solution in place. And I think by recognizing that, becoming, savvy at that, I was able to distinguish myself a little bit.
Totally. I think that's really well said. And, one thing that I always kind of think back upon is like in those early career opportunities, even those like minuscule, super small tasks like you're talking about, like those definitely hold a lot of weight because those around you in higher end leadership positions, they're looking, it's like, hey, we can trust Eric. He did these tasks for us. He did a great job. And, a lot of times your reward now is more challenging tasks, which, people don't always think about, but they give you more responsibility and you need to kind of take on a lot more in that role too.
Yeah, and just to add for sure, and just to add to that, like you said, at the beginning, like the money's not great, or just in general, maybe the circumstances will be great. And I think, by recognizing, hey, this task is not something that's glamorous, or I don't look like, a bona fide scout doing this. I look more like, just some intern or someone who's lesser. Well, I'm going to do it anyway and worry about the image stuff later. And I think by kind of putting that ego to the side, and it wasn't always easy, I wasn't, always mature with that attitude, sure. But I think by making yourself available and just volunteering to do it or do it before they even need to ask for it or do it and then have that ready if it does come up, served me well. I could give like just like a real quick story is
Yeah.
in Buffalo, pre-ownership. So ownership changed hands in 2011. So I was there between 2008 and 2011. I was there, as a grad and then full time. We were kind of small budget relative to the other organizations. And, uh, for better or worse, we had to supplement our scouting. Running a scouting operation is not, a cheap endeavor. There's a lot that goes into it between the logistics and all the resources needed. And then, so we figured that we could supplement live views with this video work. And again, it isn't like it is today. Like today, I joke, but sometimes I feel like, the younger people, they have access to every game. There's programs out there where you can get OHL games, you could get Junior Games Canada college games, you could get the second league in Germany, and it was not like that. So I had to rely on just being resourceful, having a network of coaches that would send me DVDs, even VHS tapes in the mail, and I would import that stuff and chop it up myself. A lot of times the video wasn't even good or legible. So I would go to rinks with the camera myself. So otherwise scouting events. So every other team would be there with their scouts and scout credentials, and I would be there. But rather than, taking notes, I was filming the game. And it was met with pushback externally and even internally. And other people, didn't want to do that, didn't want to be the guy holding the camera. They wanted to be a hockey ops person, and I completely get that. And I wanted to do the same. But I was able to push through that and kind of put that aside And so I started, traveling more. Yeah, I still had the camera, but I was on the road. I was on the road with the scouts. I was at games where, other people weren't. I was in the building. And then I was going to Europe with the camera. And then sure enough, a couple years later, I was able to delegate those responsibilities elsewhere, or maybe use technology that took over, and I was now scouting. So like I do strongly feel that it led to that. And even though at the time it didn't feel glamorous, it definitely was a difference maker for me.
Totally, and that's an awesome story. I've definitely heard from other like NHL video coaches those stories of like, oh, we'll leave the DVD up in the ceiling of the video
Oh,
room, and all those crazy ways in which video,
yeah,
in past, even not
for
that long
sure.
ago, has changed to make our lives a little bit easier now. But
Yeah.
totally agree. Like if your job is filming the hockey game, like you really aren't even watching the game. Like you have no
No,
idea what's going
no,
on.
you watch it
Uh,
after. Yeah.
you're watching after, and you're obviously in that role to film the game, so you got to make sure that you're doing it and doing it to a good job. But to your point too, Eric, doing that over a long period of time, then you can start to get to a position where, okay, yeah, now maybe I can delegate this or have these conversations with the scouts too. So really
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that. And wanted to also ask you a little bit, kind of just like a philosophical kind of draft schedule or process, I'd say. You talked about at the top how you're now kind of in the pro scouting world, but I know you were able to work in the amateur scouting world with Buffalo as well. So I just think that the NHL draft has so many kind of, challenges with evaluating players from so many different leagues. And even still now, we're having so many changes with players playing in junior hockey. And now you get a handful of prospects that are playing in the NCAA, and that doesn't even factor in all those playing overseas. Like, what are some of those kind of inherent challenges with scouting the draft and doing those amateur scouting and trying to compare players between different leagues?
Yeah, I think you kind of said it at the end there. It's between the different leagues that makes it difficult. And what I mean by that is the balance. Amateur scouting, dissimilar to pro scouting, I think it's open-ended. Every draft is, of course, different because every player is different and every player pool is going to be different. So one draft might look good on paper, another might not look as good or as impressive. You might have a top 10 pick that year. You might have five of the top 10 players playing junior hockey. The next year, there might be a player in the top five who's playing high school hockey, and then or junior A, BC League, or playing in Europe, not for the men's team, but for the junior team. So there's, I'm going to say I'm just a dozen amateur leagues, environments, venues where these 17, 18-year-olds are playing out of. Now they're 17, 18. So just projecting what they're going to be when they're 23, 24 is hard enough. But balancing, what does 80 points look like in the OHL versus 45 points in the NCAA, or 120 points in 38 games in Minnesota high school? It's like these, the goalposts keep moving. Um, I think that's tough. I think you could spend your entire life scouting and you always have to, have those checks and balances in place to make sure you're staying calibrated. At the end of the day, you want to answer what are they at the NHL level? Because that's the North Star that you're working towards. What are they at the NHL level? Where do they fit on a team? Of course, you can't say a 17 or 18-year-old is going to be that when they're 23, because as we know, just look at the probabilities. Just because a kid's a stud in juniors or college, depending on where they're drafted or all these circumstances, it's hard. It's hard to make the NHL. It's hard to get a contract. It's hard to get playing time in the minor leagues. It's hard to make the NHL. And from there, obviously. So I think to wrap it up, I think you really have to always focus on what are they at the NHL level and how does it equate. I really believe in this idea of making it equate because there's different ways to become a player. So if you have your different building blocks of how you're going to evaluate, let's say, size, hockey strength, hockey sense, skill, compete, skating, of course. You have all these things, depending on what team you're with, you might add some or detract some, but really these are the general building blocks. Um, there's different equations that are going to set a player up for success. I'll give you a couple examples. Let's say a player doesn't skate very well, but they have high compete and they're 6'4". Okay. And they have some skill. They have some scoring touch. Okay, well, we could work on the skating. We can get it to where it's going to be. We know they're the type of player based on our own homework and our own information and the body of work throughout the year that they're willing to work and they fit our type of intangibles profile of, hey, this kid's going to put the work in, or at least I think that he will, or there's a high likelihood he will. Couple that together with size. And so now you think, well, this might be an educated, this is probably better than just throwing a dart. This has, some education, we're playing the odds a little bit here. It equates to a player. Now you don't know, is that big body going to equate to a top six role, a power forward, or is it going to equate to an energy guy and someone who's on the fourth line, maybe killing penalties? Hey, both are going to make it to the NHL, which, exceeds the probability of a late round pick anyway. But of course, it's tough to acquire skill, and the draft is, one of the few areas where you actually have a chance to swing the bat and acquire a skill player. So, another equation, I'll go through this quickly, but like, a kid can be very athletic and a great skater, skating and has the speed, separation speed, some skill, uh, average hockey sense, and below average compete. Hmm. Okay, well, the upside's there for sure. But the average hockey sense, well, what does that mean? It means, they probably need maybe they need someone to get them the puck. They need someone to do the heavy lifting, but they'll score. They got the skill and they got the speed to get there, of course, and the deception. But the average hockey sense, and maybe I'll add size to this. Maybe they're 5'10". They're not 6'2", they're 5'10". So they have to be a skill guy. They don't have that energy role to fall back on. So again, it just comes back to this equation of does it equate? And I could spend all day going through different equations. I posted something years ago talking about this, and the example I use, it's a poor example, but I use it anyway, is rock, paper, scissors. It's like, yeah, certain things will beat rock, certain things will beat scissors, but not everything lines up. It has to equate in a certain pattern. And you do that times all these different variations, and that's how you figure out, how to use your 7 draft picks or however many picks you're going in with.
Yeah, totally. And I think you nailed it in just kind of talking about, making that the projection at the NHL level. Like just because a guy produced in junior doesn't necessarily automatically mean that they would be able to produce at the NHL level or even in the American Hockey League when they get there too. So that's
And
kind of
and
where
vice
they're,
versa too. It can
yeah,
go the other way very
for sure.
well. You can look at a player who's has high upside and but hasn't developed yet. So there's sometimes you get a player who's already trained and already had every resource available to them. Well, how much higher is that ceiling going to go? Of course, you don't say that across the board. It's case by case example, but it is a valid concern sometimes. And conversely, here's a player who's raw, but he has these raw attributes and, and he's athletic, has size, willing to work. Okay, get him into a pro environment, get him into a more structured environment, even like juniors, where, yeah, you're going to have good coaching, you're going to have more resources. Can that young player get to another level? And if they do, like, what's the upside? And if the upside's pretty good, like for me, that's definitely a player that I have time for.
Totally. And I think that's well said. And I think this is an awesome conversation and kind of picking your, philosophical brain in the scouting world. And one other area I want to add on to hear your thoughts on are just kind of the overall concept of, evaluating somebody's character as well, because we all know that, the more talented, the more skilled you are, the more, I guess, leeway you can have in having, I guess, what you may say, questionable character versus, you could talk to a coach and be like, oh, well, he's a great kid, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to project and be a superstar at the NHL level. So how much of your work in scouting also includes talking with coaches, talking with other teammates of players, and really kind of evaluating that character side? And how does that factor into your projection as well?
Well, I think for me on the amateur side, it's crucial and it's just part of the process. It's part, I always use this term body of work because to be honest with you, it is more than just going to the games and writing a game report. Our amateur scouts across the league, like they spend a lot of time peeling away these layers and doing the extra work. And maybe the season ends for a junior player in late March or late April, and the draft is in late June. You're going to have the combine. You're going to have every team is different. Every team conducts their processes different and allocates their time differently, but that's a huge component, the background information. You don't want to be surprised And more than that, and I can just tell you, and I think this could be said for any job and any career across the board, is, your boss does not want to be surprised, in a negative light if that were to happen. So it just goes back to having that accountability. If you're going to vouch for a guy, and you have to vouch for somebody, you can't hedge everything. If you're going to be a scout, you need to, stand on your own work and have substance behind it. And on the amateur side, it's difficult enough. So you really want to make sure, that you've done a thorough job in finding out that background information, whether you call it intangibles or off the ice habits or whatever. Now, do you take it all as 100% gospel? I don't know. That depends. How well do you know this person? Do you have conflicting reports? But that's definitely something for an amateur scout to figure out. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. I was just going to add on the pro side, it's, things are more finite. They're not as more open-ended. A lot of the work has already been narrowed down. You're not projecting a 17, 18-year-old, but one thing that's has benefited me is it compounds. So if you watched a kid at 17, 18, and now you're watching him and he's a reserve list player and he's 20, 21, and then he signs and he's 23, and then he makes the NHL at 24, and his name comes up in a trade at 26, you have a body of work to go on, like, and it just compounds. And you've seen this player either get better or stagnate or anything in between. Usually you have a book of reports to reference from that.
Totally. And I think that's awesome that you're able to kind of see those different parallels in, the kind of whole scouting process, like you talked about with the amateur side, and then, working up into the AHL level, which is obviously where you're at now. So awesome. Really appreciate that conversation. I'm sure we could talk for another hour on scouting
Yeah,
philosophy. So, but I thought that was really good information and good for anybody that's interested in scouting, not even just in hockey, but, any sports.
yeah,
There's
well,
definitely a
for
lot of good
sure.
takeaways there as well. But I want to kind of get into a conversation about pipeline hockey as well. I know I was really excited to have Eric on this podcast because he gives back so much to the hockey operations community. And, in our calls leading up to this podcast, we've kind of touched on how, it can be a little bit unique or, uncertain in how you break in, even as Eric shared and how he was able to break in the hockey ops world. But I know giving back to the, hockey community is something that you're really passionate about. So would love for you to be able to share a little bit about what is pipeline hockey and how can maybe people get involved to continue to learn more on what it is that hockey ops entails.
Yeah, I launched Pipeline Hockey, and basically to solve the issue of providing a foundational framework for those interested in hockey ops and more specifically scouting operations, within the NHL and within professional hockey. On LinkedIn, I am, continuously receive messages, outreach, from people, not just students, but from people from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life that want to have a conversation. And I've done a lot of them, and really enjoyed it, and have really been impressed with some of these backgrounds, yourself included, these people I talk to, the maturity, their scope of knowledge already, not just in hockey, but, the dedication that they put into their own education or their own work background. And it's tough to answer everybody and to allocate 20, 30 minutes to everybody who reaches out for a phone call. And I used to do it more in the past, and then I got bogged down a little bit. And I really started to realize, that, sport management, does not often focus on hockey operations specifically. Maybe it's too niche, maybe they don't have room for it, whatever. But there is a foundational framework that would really work well as a supplement to sport management coursework in a formal setting. And it's not being taught in that formal setting. So I always wanted to kind of teach this. And after some discussions with colleges and universities, and even doing some panels myself, and speaking with Cortland a little bit, without a graduate degree, it's tough to land a role as an adjunct professor. So I really just, realized, what if I just taught it myself? It's not like it is 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You have Zoom. The world is so interconnected. So why not share this information? It's meant, as an education, in the same way you would take a college course to best set you up for your future career. And I was really able to kind of narrow it down into right now I have six different modules. The first one that I'm going to launch is the amateur scouting landscape. I'm looking to go chronologically from amateur scouting to reserve list to pro scouting to the mechanics of the CBA to even, game report documentation and how to write a game report, how to make a case for a player, that sort of thing. But really, these are all foundational pieces for people that want to work in hockey ops. There's a lot that I had to learn on the job, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be like that. I think students can set themselves up for success, and this is one of the ways they could do it by supplementing their coursework. So that's the idea behind Pipeline Hockey. I'm looking to launch it in June. It's kind of a moving target right now because my first and foremost, of course, my primary career and our American League affiliate is in the middle of a playoff run. I haven't been able, but as far as the framework goes and the infrastructure and even the curriculum, all that's ready to go. So, I'm going to launch it in June. That's the plan. And, hopefully some people find a benefit in it.
Totally. And I think that there's definitely a lot of people that have an appetite for that as well, that want to continue to learn more in hockey ops. And, hey, you don't know what you don't know. So it's opportunities like this that allow you an opportunity to just be set up a little bit more for success, that when you do land opportunities to work in hockey ops, you're just a little bit more kind of caught up to speed on that. So we really appreciate, your willingness to help out others in the hockey ops world. And we'll definitely share more information on Pipeline Hockey in the description of this podcast
Cool.
for everybody as well. And kind of on that same note, like, you're now in a spot where you're able to kind of give back to some people and be a mentor to others. Like for you, Eric, in your career, like who would you say are some of those mentors that really kind of helped, you out in your career, that really laid a positive impact on, setting you up for success? It could be specifically in the hockey ops world or anyone you came across that's been an impactful mentor to you.
Yeah, I was lucky because in Buffalo, when I came into Buffalo at 21, uh, three people come to mind. There were three people that, were running the various departments. Darcy Regier, the general manager at the time. There was John Cristiano, who was running Buffalo's pro scouting at the time. He had previously coached all over the world, but Rochester Amherst, who are our minor league team, and then him and Darcy were in the front office together. And then a really important guy, in that early stage of my career is a man named Kevin Devine, who was the head amateur scout for Buffalo. And I mentioned Kevin because he's an old school, like traditional scout guy. He's from, Prince Edward Island, Canada. He played, he played in the 70s and 80s and just traditional as it got. And there was a lot of pushback on video, and video at the time was my foot in the door. I was cutting video. I was trying to make it visible. It was my foot in the door to kind of reach that next level. And Kevin made time for it, and he definitely didn't have to. And I think, at the time, it wasn't a popular thing to do, especially for a traditional scout. And he was, like I said, as some would consider an old school guy, and he made a lot of time for it. And not only that, but like, made himself available to me, but also allowed me to have access to meetings. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a long, long time before I had a voice in meetings, before I could stand up and make a case for a player or argue with a scout whose job was to be out in the field full time. I was running the meeting. I was entering names into an Excel document, hoping they would watch the video that I prepared. Maybe I could get a pat on the back here and there. But same with Darcy, who's the GM, and John, is these are guys that had spent their entire lives in hockey already, had played, had coached. They didn't need to do that stuff, and they did anyway. And it wasn't a mentor relationship in the sense where like, it didn't look like one. It wasn't like, hey, this is my guy. I'm taking him under my wing. I'm going to teach you everything I know. It wasn't like that. It's great when people have that. If you can find that in any industry, that's awesome. And I've seen people really take advantage of that. And I would encourage people to try and seek that out when it's possible. I didn't have that. I can't point to one person that, took me under their wing, but I think just as important, I had these people that gave me that access through opportunity. Kevin, going back to him, had time when I said, hey, this under 18 tournament, there's one in August. It's not this April one that's on TSN and all that stuff. There's one in August, the Ivan Holinka. At the time, it was not in Edmonton yet. It was only in Slovakia and Czech. You couldn't even get a web broadcast. There was no way you're getting video of this. You had to be there. So I said, what if I took the camera to Europe And it took a little bit of lobbying and a couple years, but eventually, yeah, he gave me the go ahead. And then once I did it once, I was doing it all the years. And then eventually, I passed the camera off. But he was open to things. He was open to ideas when he had enough on his plate already. And looking back, I really, really appreciate that. And it was a huge difference maker for me. And then kind of just moving forward to today, like the LA Kings, like I laugh because when I went from Buffalo to LA, I remember that first summer, that first training camp or orient, they called me and they said, yeah, come, we'll give you, your bag of gear and you can meet some of the people. But nobody knew who I was because I didn't play. And the LA staff, and most of them are still there, but GM was Rob Blake, president of the team, Luke Robitaille. Uh, Player development, Glenn Murray and Nelson Emerson, who I work with, pretty tightly today and are awesome guys. Uh, Matt Green had just retired after winning two Stanley Cups and being one of the captains and like de facto leaders on team, one of the toughest defensemen to play against. And then I could probably name 5 or 10 or 15 other people too that are just equally as impressive. So it was like, you know, I was used to working in the industry, but I was like, wow, like, and then there's me, SUNY Cortland, and
Yeah.
so it's funny to think. So same sort of thing. Like I was lucky because you learn from those people, and it wasn't their idea to kind of have me in the circle, and it wasn't this overnight thing. But yeah, again, like I over time was able to have that access and build those relationships and those networks and become part of it. And that's a special group, and it's hard to play in the NHL, and it's hard to be of that status, and it's something I still don't take lightly even today. So I was lucky in that sense.
Totally. And yeah, that's one of those moments I'm sure where you're looking around the room and you have that brief moment. You're like, man, like, how did I get here? But then it also gives you some confidence, like, well, I earned my way here too. Even if it came from a maybe non-traditional playing background, it came a lot of times through your hard work and,
Yeah.
building trust with others. And yeah, doing trips like that, bringing your camera over for the Ivan Halinka. That's, one of those moments that I'm sure they paid off to get you in that spot too. So appreciate you
Oh
kind of
yeah.
sharing on that as well,
I
Eric.
still get chirps about the camera stuff even
Yeah.
today. Yeah. The
As
same
as
guys.
as anybody in hockey would, you got to have
Yeah.
some chirps and be able to laugh it off. So, but that's awesome to hear and appreciate you highlighting, some of those people that have helped you up for success too. So,
Yeah.
with that
Great.
being said, I do want to transition into our Flash Friday segment. So we do this with all of our guests, Eric, on the Front Office U Friday episodes, get to know your personality a little bit better before we wrap things up for the episode. So, with your experience being bulkly in the American Hockey League now, in terms of where you're scouting, give me your favorite American Hockey League city to visit when you're on a scouting trip to go for a game. What city are you most excited to go visit in the American Hockey League?
This one's biased, but I love the Pacific Division teams just because the landscape is gorgeous. You got to understand, the vast majority of the year you're in these cold, gray, rainy, all the elements by yourself. It's not glamorous, not always. And then I'm lucky because I get to spend time in Ontario where our AHL team is, and it's beautiful. It's like even San Diego, Henderson, all these rinks I love because a lot of them have like during the intermission they have like. It's not a smoking area, but it's like a porch. Basically, you can walk out and get some fresh air. It's usually 70 degrees, 75 degrees, and you're looking at the mountains as the sun's going down. That's not bad. Yeah, I always love the Pacific ones.
That's awesome. Well, shout out to the AHL for making a Pacific Division here
Yeah,
over the
for
last
sure.
handful of years. They were looking out for people like you, Eric, to give them somewhere where there's some sunshine in the AHL. So that's awesome. And then kind of similar note, you're obviously at a lot of hockey games. First intermission comes by, you're walking around the concourse, you see the concession stand. What is one snack that you always look to pick out if you're at a game for first or second intermission? Give you a little pick me up before the game
Uh,
begins.
I don't know. I roll my eyes because I've spent you promise yourself that you're going to eat better this season and you're not going to do that stuff. But when you're at the game and you're hungry and you've been driving all day and you didn't have time and your flight was delayed and you couldn't check in and you didn't have time to grab a bite. So what's my go-to? Yeah, I usually grab like a coffee, but you know what I love is those like cheap coffees that are like the French vanilla and they're super sugary. And I don't even know if there's like any coffee in there or it's really just like drinking a candy bar.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that's probably my guilty pleasure. I'll have one of those and get wired up.
Love that. That's a good answer for sure. Keep you on high alert for when the game picks back up
Yeah. Oh,
for
for
puck
sure.
drops. So love that answer from you as well, Eric. And then last one I'll ask you is favorite all time either movie or TV show. And I'll say for me personally, like we spend so much time watching hockey that it's like weird when I'm like sitting down watching TV and it's like not hockey or not live sports honestly going on. But when you do crazy concept, when you do have a brief moment where you're not watching hockey and you throw on a movie or TV show, what would you say is your all-time favorite?
So my wife and I just finished, well, for me, it was a rewatch of The Wire. That's like one of my favorite all-time shows. And then another HBO one, The Sopranos, obviously. It's a popular answer, probably. Those are two go-tos. I grew up loving The Simpsons as a kid. I don't watch it so much anymore, but all the like jokes still are fresh in my mind. Yeah, so yeah, probably those ones. Uh, yeah, or I'll just like cruise and find like a weird documentary on YouTube.
Yeah, I like that. I was a huge Simpsons nerd. Like I definitely have a
Yeah.
lot of Bart Simpson in my personality because of it. And yeah, I always think of like yeah, like the random like quotes from The Simpsons.
Oh yeah.
My parents would always make fun of me because I would always be like, "Oh, there was one time or this thing happened on The Simpsons and they predicted the
Oh my
future
God.
and all this random stuff." So I can definitely highly relate to that comment as well. So appreciate you sharing on all there, Eric. It's been a ton of fun. Obviously, as we touched on earlier, we're going to share the information for Pipeline Hockey here in the description of this
Cool.
podcast. But for our listeners that have made it all the way through, that have an interest in your career in the scouting world, in the LA Kings, what would be the best way for them to get in contact with you if they have any follow-up questions of their own?
Yeah, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. It works for me. It's if I don't get back to you right away, it's not because I'm ignoring you or don't have time for you, but I will. And yeah, sometimes I'll post some stuff on there. This summer I plan to be a little bit more engaged with the pipeline hockey stuff going on. So yeah, that's probably the best way.
Cool. Love to hear that. And yeah, as mentioned, we'll throw the link to Eric's LinkedIn here in the description of the podcast as well. It's a big reason we started up the podcast to connect you with people that are, in the sports industry, having a lot of success, have a lot of information to share. And Eric obviously is a prime example of that with how he's looking to give back here with the pipeline hockey to help those interested in scouting and the hockey ops world. So definitely highly encourage all of you listeners to be following up with Eric and get in contact of your own. But with that being said, we'll wrap things up for this episode. We'll be back again next Friday with a new Front Office U episode. Take care, everybody.